Series through the book of Mark. We are in chapter 2, and we're looking at verses 13 through 26, and I titled it Eating, Drinking, and Breaking the Sabbath. This probably is one of these very familiar teachings that has a whole lot more to it than what we first realize. And there is I really don't know if it's a parable or a teaching, which way you would classify it in the middle of this, that has just surprised me when you really dig into what it is teaching. And then there's another story that Jesus tells that also is surprising once you understand what's going on. So we have a number of very interesting things that demonstrates how great a teacher our Jesus is. The way that he is able to communicate truths, and the stories that he uses to do that, and the meaning behind them are fascinating. So it's, like I said, there's just so much here, and some of it will lap over into next week simply because there's just too much to cover. Even though we're going to cover all of this section, a lot of the same teachings are in chapter 3. Verse 13 is where we'll begin. And he went out again by the seashore, and all the people were coming to him, and he was teaching them. Now Jesus had been going around from synagogue to synagogue as he traveled around Samaria and Judea, and he was going to different synagogues and he was teaching there. But there was also a number of, as time goes on, that he was kind of, you might say, not welcome. The leaders of the synagogues weren't real happy to see him because he was causing problems in their mind. Now that wasn't true everywhere, because there still was many times he would go to a synagogue. But it's just fascinating when you look at it and you see that here is Jesus, the Son of God, very God of very God, going to the house of worship for God and being told that you're not welcome here. It's like saying, God, I don't want you in my church. Literally, that's what was going on. So we have kind of the beginning of this problem, but like I said, it wasn't always. There was still places that he was permitted to be. Some of he was welcome, some of he just permitted. Verse 14, as he passed by, he saw Levi, the son of Alphaeus, sitting in a tax booth, and he said to him, follow me. And he got up and followed him. Now Levi we know him as Matthew. We have a number of times of these names that they use one name here and another name here, and it means the same person. So in this one, Levi is Matthew. Right? Now, I never thought of this before until I really started digging here, was the fact that Levi is sitting in a tax booth because he's a tax collector. And tax collectors, of course, were not very liked people. Matter of fact, they were kind of hated people. And understandably so, because who just says, oh, wonderful, it's April 15 again, and I am all excited, I get to pay my taxes. I've been looking forward to this all year long, and finally the day has arrived. So let's have a celebration day. On April 15 should be a national holiday of joy and excitement. Have you ever heard anybody offer that as an idea to our government to make a change? No, because nobody likes to pay taxes. Well, in those days, it was no different. Nobody liked to pay taxes. And what was even worse, you have somebody who is a Jew that is now working for the Romans collecting taxes. A double whammy, you might say. But the fascinating thing when we really look at this, you have to remember that Matthew is now the 5th called disciple. Okay? We have, you might say, Peter and, let's see, who was it all of a sudden? Peter, Andrew, James, and John had been called. If you remember, they were fishermen. Matthew is a tax collector. Why is that important? Because first of all, the first 4, if things didn't work out with Jesus, they could go back to the boats. they would still be able to make a living. They would have only lost that time that they was with Jesus. If they figured out that, no, this wasn't the thing I want to do, I'm not so sure about this Jesus, I'll just go back to the boats. Matthew would never have that option. Once he quit his job as a tax collector, he was not going to get that job back. It paid well, but he was never going to get it back. And on top of it, there was got to be a single Jew that would be willing to hire him because he was a tax collector. So for him, it was a decision that was going to forever change his life. It was going to be, his commitment was so much greater than the first four. So when we look at that and we say, that was quite a commitment. Now, common sense tells us that he had been following Jesus for a while. He knew who Jesus was. And so it wasn't like he's in this tax booth, Jesus comes walking by, never met before, know nothing about him, and he just says, follow me, and he got him out and followed him. I don't think that really is how it happened. The Bible doesn't give us a long drawn out, but common sense tells us certain things. So he knew enough, but he was willing. He was willing to immediately, and that's the other part that's so interesting. It wasn't like, well, let me think about it. I'll get back in touch with you next week. No, Matthew said, I'm on my way. You called me, I'm ready. See, Jesus was looking for the lost. We see that so many times. And here we have Matthew would fit in that category of one of the lost. But Jesus reaches out to him, and he responds in a way that we all could learn from. Verse 15, and it happened that he was reclined at the table in his house. Now, grasp that this is Levi's house, not Jesus' house. Jesus didn't have a house. Levi had a house. Okay? And many tax collectors and sinners were dining with Jesus and his disciples, for there were many of them, and they were following him. So Jesus had a following of sinners and tax collectors. Tax collectors we already understood. Now, who are the sinners? Okay, in our modern terminology, we say everybody. Okay, we're all sinners. But in those days, when you took that said somebody is a sinner, it was because that they did not perfectly follow the law. And not just the Old Testament law, but all the add-on rules and regulations that the Pharisees had come up with. So you had hundreds of additional ones. And if they didn't follow them, if you walked a little bit too far on the Sabbath, you were a sinner. If you didn't wash your hands in the proper way, you were a sinner. There was a whole host of things that people would do, and they would be called a sinner and classified as a sinner. They didn't show up on the Sabbath for synagogue. If they missed the day, they were a sinner. If they got sick, they were a sinner. Because good people don't get sick. Only sinners get sick. So the body of sinners here doesn't necessarily mean that these were a bunch of robbers and killers and bike gangs. That's not necessarily who they were. They were your average people. But the average people that didn't follow all the rules the Pharisees had set up. And there were many that were following him. The tax collectors and the sinners. Verse 16 and 17, when the scribes and the Pharisees saw that he was eating with sinners and tax collectors, they said to his disciples, why is he eating and drinking with tax collectors and sinners? And hearing this, Jesus said to them, it is not those who are healthy who need a physician, but those who are sick. I did not come to call the righteous, but sinners. Now that can easily be twisted if you're not careful. I did not come to call the righteous, but sinners. Who were the righteous in Jesus' statement?
Holier than thou.
Yeah, the Pharisees, the ones who were bringing the accusation. Okay, they were the righteous in their own mind, and everybody else was a sinner. But here is you're breaking the rules again by simply eating with them. So Jesus would be called a sinner because he was eating with sinners. Says, why does he do that? If he is a rabbi, if he is from God, he would never do this. There is no way that a true teacher sent from God, a true prophet sent from God, would do these things. So he must be a sinner. Verses 18 and 19. John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting, and they came and said to him, why do John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast? And Jesus said to them, while the bridegroom is with them and the attendants of the bridegroom cannot fast, can they? So long as they have the bridegroom with them, they cannot fast. Now, this one here is another one of these. You have to know the customs of the day in order to understand what Jesus is teaching. So we'll delve into that a little bit. See, Jesus is telling a vivid picture to tell the Pharisees why his disciples did not fast. Okay, after a Jewish wedding, the couple did not go away on a honeymoon. They stayed at home for a week or so, 10 days. An open house was kept, and there was continual feasting and rejoicing. To that week of happiness was invited the closest friends of the bride and the bridegroom. They were called by the name children of the bride chamber. Okay, so you have the comparison Jesus is using to a wedding and the wedding feast. Now, the wedding feast, like I said, it lasted for a week or a little bit more, and it was something in which they would come and they would rejoice with the bridegroom because of the fact of what was happening. It was a wedding. Jesus is comparing it to the fact that he is the bridegroom and that the disciples are the bridesmaids, so there's no reason for them to fast. Or you might call them the best men or groomsmen or whatever we would today. Because you don't fast while you are rejoicing for that rejoicing week. And it gets even further. See, Jesus likened his little company to men who were children of the bride chamber, chosen guests at a wedding feast. There actually was a rabbinic ruling which said, all in attendance on the bridegroom are relieved from all religious observations which would lessen their joy. I found that fascinating. You see, we're going to have this feast and all the excitement and joy that's going on. And if some religious observance would lessen that joy, during that week or so, you're exempt from it. Fasting would be one of those. So when he's talking to the Pharisees and using this terminology, they know exactly what he's saying. The people of that day would have known exactly what he's saying. That as long as I am with them, we should be celebrating and have joy, because we'll go on and we'll see what happens when he leaves. But while I am with them, while they have the bridegroom with them, they can't fast. That would be contrary to our customs and our laws, because we don't fast at a wedding feast. Kind of an oxymoron here, wouldn't it? Okay, we're going to have a feast, but you have to fast. No, it doesn't work that way. It's one or the other. But see, this instance also tells us so much about us. It tells us the characteristics of the Christian attitude should be joy. See, because we have Jesus with us. We are the ones, you might say, that are tied in with this whole wedding concept. If we have Jesus with us, if we have Jesus in us, we have joy. There should be joy, not sadness and sorrow, but there should be joy. Because the wedding guests they're freed from this obligation. Verse 20. And here's how Jesus wraps it up. But the days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast in that day. Now, here again, a translation gets it a little bit off, so we miss the true meaning here. See, where the words are taken away, it really could be translated snatched away. See, and this fits perfectly into the day when Judas betrayed Jesus. And Jesus wasn't just taken away, he was snatched away. Verse 21. And another one of these areas where the reality is greater than your first knowledge. No one sews a patch of unshrunk cloth on an old garment. Otherwise, the patch pulls away from it. The new from the old, and the worst tear results. Like, okay, everybody knows that Jesus is really given what is known as a sewing lesson, right? I don't think so. I think that the people kind of understood that concept. They pretty much had that part figured out. So he must be teaching something else. How does that relate? Okay? And it does, because we go into the next set where it talks about the wineskins. They both work together to give us another teaching again. Right? So the same is true, you might say, to the Jews that are listening. Because we have to remember back in those days when Jesus came, the religious leaders were leading the people was totally wrong. There was so much, there was all of these regulations and rules that God had not commanded. You wouldn't find them in the Torah. These were add-ons. Interestingly, that actually during the time for almost the 400 silent years before Jesus came, idol worship with the Jews had pretty much stopped. If we look back in their history, they always kept falling back to the idols. But the idols worship pretty much ended. By the time Jesus came on the scene, idol worship with the Jews was a non-existent thing. They did not worship idols. But without realizing it, they had built a brand new one. They had built the idol of the God of their design that was going to come and free them from the Roman conquerors. They were so caught up into the concept that when the Messiah comes, he's going to make everything right and set it all straight. He is going to come and he's going to solve our problems of our oppressors in the miraculous way as he did throughout our history, because when we cried out to him, and we have not been worshiping idols for a long, long time, so that Messiah is going to come, he's going to see how good we really are, and he's going to change everything. Well, they were partially right. He was going to change everything. See, he wasn't going to just take and patch the tear. He was going to demonstrate that that tear needed to be removed, and it had to be solved, because what you're doing is you're following a false religion. And the Jewish religion at that time had become very much a false religion, because it was full of false teachings. You see, like in the end of the book of Revelation, it talks about do not add or take away from this book, which I believe is talking about all of Scripture. Okay? But what the Jews were doing is they were adding and adding and adding and adding all of these restrictions to take away the joy of the people. Jesus was making that point blank clear. So you have to shrink the new cloth before you can patch the old tear. Or you have to prepare yourself first, and then you can work on repairing the problem. We would say that today in the church. We have to prepare ourselves first before we can even begin to think about fixing any problems in the church. Because but then we have the wineskins bring us to the next level. Because the Jews were looking for an earthly deliverer. Jesus did not come to be an earthly deliverer. But as it was true repairing the old garment, the new cloth would need shrunk before it was used. Jesus, as the master teacher, would use the familiar to bridge to the new, or clearer understanding of the old. See, Jesus wasn't changing the old. He was just showing the people how to understand the old, how to see it clearly and correctly. See, by the time of the Reformation, it needed to tear itself away totally. It no longer could repair it. Okay? The Catholic Church was into such disarray and had wandered so far from the truth that a repair was no longer possible. Luther tried real hard. And that's why you might say you will see in the Lutheran Church, you will see a lot of the windows being painted up fancy, all of those pomp and circumstance stuff, because Luther wanted to hold on to as much of the Catholic Church that he could, but he could not hold on to a lot of the teachings, so he had to separate. Now you had people like John Knox and John Calvin and they wanted to totally do away with it, and that's why most Protestant churches don't have that. The stained glass windows and all the fanciness. Now some do, but to a large extent they don't. And I find it fascinating, and the Baptists want to go one step further, and let's make it just as plain Jane as we possibly can, because the building is not important. Well, they're correct in that, they're not. But anyway, it's kind of the way that history lays itself out. But a patch should be tried first. Verse 22, no one puts new wine into old wineskins, or the wine will burst the skins. And the wine is lost in the skins as well. But one puts new wine into fresh wineskins. See, here we had the tear, which you can repair. But now we have a bursting. You don't repair a bursting wineskin. It basically has to be thrown away. So the opposite is true in our day. Let's say whether something is torn away from the true teaching. Moving to what is known as liberal theology, which is very common in our world today. It's kind of becomes what you might call a feel-good. See, the feelings are in so many churches the important thing, that you feel good. But when you come to the truth, you're going to find times that it's not going to feel so good. So this feel-good, this promise of we're just going to make everything good for you, comfortable. But what happens? It will burst. And this has happened over and over again through the centuries. Whenever people in congregations have wandered away from the truth, eventually it will burst. And everything is lost. How many times have I talked with people that absolutely refuse to come to church because of something that happened in the church? They might be right, they may be wrong, that's not the important part. The important part is, are we as a congregation welcoming? Do we have certain standards that people have to meet before they can become part of this body? And the answer is no, we don't. We are looking to be true to the Word of God. But part of that is to share the joy of knowing Jesus. So the old must become new again, but the new, it might be new to us. Not necessarily new. I equate it to my 1965 Chevy grocery getter with 100,000 miles on it. Finally replaced it with something newer. Now it was the newer new. No, it wasn't, but it was new to me. New to us. Right. It's not getting rid of the old, it's getting rid of the bad in the old and the new. And you have to remember, what Jesus was teaching to the vast majority of people was brand new. They had never heard this stuff before. And that's why there was such an uproar by the church leaders. Because he was teaching these things that they had never heard before, and it was contrary to what they had been teaching. Fasting was one of them. Verse 23 and 24, and it happened as he was passing through the green fields on the Sabbath, and his disciples began to take their way along while plucking the heads of the grain, the Pharisees were saying to him, look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath? Now, at first glance, it sounds like, yeah, the Pharisees, calm down, but the disciples, do you really have the right to steal somebody else's grain? And the answer to that question is yes. In Deuteronomy 23:25, actually gives you that example. When you enter your neighbor's standing grain, then you may pluck the heads with your hand, but you shall not wield a sickle in your neighbor's standing grain. In other words, you're walking through, you're hungry, you want some, you're welcome to it. But you can't start harvesting his grain and start hoarding it, okay? But walking through, yes, you may. So, no, the disciples were doing what actually the Old Testament law said was okay. But see, the need for food is healthy. And the word for healthy in the Greek is the same as holy. I found that fascinating. It's the same root word, healthy and holy. Because the need for food is both healthy and holy. Because obviously, do people still get hungry on the Sabbath? That was always true. You see, if food was a restricted thing, you couldn't eat food. Now, there were plenty that said you couldn't prepare food, but no, food is part of what God has given to us. See, the fact that man gets hungry suggests that the Sabbath demonstrates that food has a sacredness to it. Jesus illustrates that with his reply to the Pharisees in verse 25 and 26. Then he said to them, have you never read what David did when he was in need, and he and his companions became hungry? How he entered the house of God at the time of Abiathar the high priest and ate the consecrated bread, which is not lawful for anyone to eat except the priest, and he also gave it to those who were with him. See, Jesus is using an example going back to David, and of course they had a great respect for David, King David. I mean, that was their great king, so they really had a hard time to argue with what David had done. Jesus was demonstrating that food, eating of food in and of itself, is sacred. We need it. Separating it out, there are circumstances in which it no longer is a problem, because work had been classified under 39 different heads. And 4 of these heads were reaping, winnowing, thrashing, and preparing a meal. See what I'm talking about? When they talk about the Pharisees added all these regulations. The scripture said, 6 days thou shalt labor and do all thy work, but the 7th day the Sabbath unto the Lord thy God, and it shall not do any work, you or your son, your daughter, your manservant, your maidservant, your ox or your ass. They were taking that and they were adding a bunch of restrictions to it. Okay? Reaping, in other words, they were plucking grain. Okay? Winnowing, or thrashing, or even preparing a meal. Prior to refrigeration, you would have to prepare your food on the day before. For us to be Saturday, it would be Friday, so you would have food. At least they were still letting them eat. But really the stuff was getting to the point of being ridiculous. And Jesus was trying to point out how ridiculous it is and how you're causing these tears and these burstings. His teaching on the cloth and the wineskins would really hit home because they would understand. And I think it gets lost over the years because I'll be honest with you, until I really dug into this, I never before equated the two together. But they do. It fits perfectly in what Jesus was teaching. Jesus, a master teacher. Even, you might say, well, of course he is. I mean, but still, he is. Okay? Because Jesus showed that Scripture itself supplies a precedent in which human need took precedent of human and even divine law. See, because with King David, it was human law, they can't eat it, but also it was divine law. And Jesus is saying that circumstances are such, don't get caught up as the rules. Get caught up in love instead. Because Christianity at all times consisted far more of things, of doing things, than for refraining of doing things. See, when we understand our faith, the refraining from doing things is the way that the world sees Christianity. That you're going to regulate yourself into where you can't do all of these things. But being a Christian actually does not mean that. The opposite is more true. It's more about the doing than the not doing. Don't get caught up in, and I can give you example after example of questions that I've received over the years. Good one is, can I mow the lawn on Sunday? Right? And my answer has always been, you're not asking the right question. See, the question isn't can you or can you not mow the lawn on Sunday, because you're looking at it as Sunday has a series of rules that we have to follow. Instead of looking at what am I doing on Sunday to honor my God? And maybe part of that is mowing the lawn. And maybe for some it is refraining from mowing the lawn. It's the wrong question. We get caught up in the rules. And the rules do not set us free. The opposite. Verse 27 and 28. Jesus said to them, the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. The Sabbath was made for man. What did Jesus mean by that? He meant simple common sense. You take a person and you work them 7 days a week. It doesn't work. You actually get less. I learned this in business. We learned that 55 hours a week was kind of the magic bullet. Okay? We worked 10 hours a day for 5 days, and then 5 hours on Saturday, and Sundays off. Of course, we're working on the road, so the crew is, you may say, living in hotel rooms. They wanted to work more. Because they're away from home, I might as well be out there making money. We tried it for a little while, and I realized that the amount of production we got from 60 hours was the same as we got from 55 hours. The amount of work that was accomplished. Once you got to that 55-hour mark, and that's maybe just the crew we had, production just fell off. And it did for the entire week. It was just a little less here, a little less there, a little less there. There was no benefit to us or to them. Of course, to them it was a little bigger paycheck, but it really wasn't accomplished much. Plus, they did not like it. They enjoyed that day and a half off. They realized that that was a good thing. This is when I look back and I see what Jesus meant here about the Sabbath was made for man. We need a day of rest. It's part of our human nature. It's a part of our physical being. We need it. So being a Christian does not consist of rules and regulations, and it doesn't. Okay? Sunday observance is important, but when the rules cause us to bypass kindness and justice, we place the rule ahead and above Christian service. Easy to do. I'll give you one more example before I move on to the end. And that is, years ago, my mother-in-law needed a roof reshingled on her house. Being the fact that she had a very limited income, hiring a roofer was kind of out of the question. So a number of us got together, and the only day we could do it was on a Sunday. And that was just fine, because it was service to help somebody. It wasn't going to do my job. It wasn't, you might say, it was different. So it's not so much a case, can I do this or can I do that? What is the reasoning behind it? If it's follow rules, you're missing the point. Christianity is not about following rules. So I come up with 5 takeaways. Like Matthew, are we willing to give all and follow Jesus? Are we willing to spend time with non-believers? Are we willing to give up some of life's comforts to spend time with Jesus? When we hear a tear in our common faith, are we willing to help mend it by opening the heart to God's truth and not to our perceived understandings? How do we understand Sundays? A day of rejoicing or a day of restrictions? And that last one is, I think we can all look at. How do we look at it? Were we excited about Sunday? Or, I guess I better show up for church again. People might see that I missed and, they're going to be mean to me or something. Or the opposite, for depending on your crowd you hang out with. You're going to church again? You did that last month. How much do you need? This should be a place we look forward to coming to. A place where we rejoice in singing, in praising, in learning, in fellowshipping. All of this should be part of a place. I love being here. And I can honestly say, I love being here. I look forward to this.